Hello, Ed140 class. This is John responding to your Week 9 tweets. Here we go. First up from Alba. This is directed at Kanagaraha, our author about translingualism. Alba asks, can a teacher draw from a student's translingual ability to further develop a student's knowledge of academic discourse? Great question, Alba. I'll start by saying I think that teachers should find opportunities to bring all of students' abilities into the classrooms, be them translingual or otherwise. Finding those opportunities to connect with students' primary discourses or connect with things that are interesting to them, like hip hop or pop culture. Finding those connections to academic discourse, to me, are always valuable in the classroom. When we think about translingualism specifically, I think we want to think about it first as a set of practices that people engage in this world. You know, a view of language and of discourse that tries to complicate the kind of boundaries, these bounded notions of what it means to engage in academic discourse or to engage in this kind of primary discourse. And so by teachers and students adopting that perspective of language, I think it opens up new possibilities for participation, for students in co-constructing what that academic discourse is or its relation to them in certain ways, opportunities to critique discourses, the academic discourse, or discourses in general. So those opportunities in that translingual disposition that enables those capacities or those potentials are very important. Thanks for your question, Alba. Okay, question number 2 comes from Johnson. Johnson asks Paolo Ferreri, is there a time where the banking method of education is more effective than the problem-posing concept of education? Great question, Johnson. I think we have to start off, people often think about the banking method and they look at the lecture hall and the sage on stage, the professor with all this knowledge, depositing this knowledge into the open receptacle brains of the students. And for Freire, that lecture hall is symbolic of this kind of oppressive model of education. But before Freire, the idea of the banking method is much bigger than that. It's much more of a metaphor. And what he's thinking about really is that school is designed to kind of reproduce social inequities by teaching certain kinds of history, by forcing people into certain pathways and valuing certain kinds of knowledge over other. Education is an indoctrination into a way of life, and the banking method disables people who are being oppressed by this system to realize these other potentials, to realize their own power to transform them. And so in that case, Freire would never think the banking model is effective because it encompasses a much broader political project, one about class and power. So, Freire definitely believed in having teachers in the room, right? He believed in having literacy experts, people that were experts in the academic discourse, teaching people of poverty about these things. He believed that you had to master those things to transform your own circumstances. As opposed to this kind of top-down delivery, people are producing this knowledge, producing an understanding of academic discourse through a critical mindset, one that is really focused on transforming the structures and using this academic discourse to do it. So Freire would definitely be okay with a moment in a learning situation that would appear as a banking, or which would appear that a teacher has assumed a position of teaching. But he also believes that students should be teachers too, and he believes that all of this practice of education should be around how to empower and transform one's own reality in a meaningful way. Ariana, do you think that it is possible for schools to measure the zone of proximal development of every single student? Wouldn't it be very costly and time-consuming? #Vygotsky. Well, I think if we think about the Zoped, schools do, in a way, enact ideas of the Zoped. I think, although in very limited ways, and in ways that Chris Gutierrez, for instance, from that video lecture that you watch, likely would critique. So schools, you typically begin right with a pre-assessment, a pre-test, something that will identify the baseline, the actual developmental level of the students in the class. So if it's a lesson on multiplication, a pretest may encompass different types of problems representing different levels, and a teacher looks at that and can decide, okay, this student is very advanced or this student is behind, and that identifies their actual developmental level, right? And then you move into a series of activities and homework assignments and smaller quizzes and group projects, whatever that may be, the social conditions of learning there and what a student is able to complete in that space is demonstrating a kind of potential developmental level, right? So in between that space of kind of this pretest and this working with others, there's this kind of sweet spot, this zone of proximal development. And then at the end, we have a final test, right? A big high stakes test of some kind, and that determines now your new actual developmental level, right? That test you take by yourself typically, and that's going to give you a score in relation to your peers. It's going to identify this new actual developmental level. But the critique here is that we are identifying the zones in very limited ways, right? It's just kind of one test, it's kind of one measurement of that growth. The interventions are fairly one-dimensional, and it's not being defined by the student, him or herself. Those endpoints, right? Chris Gutierrez talks about the endpoints being defined by others. And so that, I think, in your question, wouldn't it be very costly and time-consuming? Well, yes, actually, if we were to try to move to a portfolio assessment, right, that was kind of standardized but took lots of nuance into really seeing exactly how a student is growing at an individual level, the amount of labor that would go into that kind of tracking, the assessment, all of the things around that process versus a very simple standardized process would seem to promote higher costs. And so it's a very interesting question when we think about the relationship between implementing some of these theoretical ideas and the very practical but very real constraints such as budgets and funding.